My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Patrick Donovan, who is the president of the Varnum Continentals and the executive director of the Varnum Armory Military Museum. And welcome back to State of the State.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
Yes. In full disclosure, I am the secretary of the Varnum Continentals and also a docent at the museum, so I just wanted everybody to be aware of that.
A very knowledgeable docent.
Thank you. Last time you were here, we talked about the famous Gettysburg Gun that's on display at the museum right now, but also on display is the not-so-famous Bull Run gun, also known as, well, Bull Run is known as First Manassas. And although it saw action in only one battle, it still is an important part of Rhode Island military history. Can you tell our audience about the Bull Run gun?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a neglected child in our collection because it's right next to the famous, world-famous Gettysburg gun, which has an epic story associated with it. The Bull Run gun, though, is still a fascinating piece. It's arguably the most original Civil War cannon in existence in the world, which for people who are interested in weapons technology and material culture, you kind of geek out on that. But the Bull Run gun is it's on its original carriage, which is incredibly rare. Just a handful of cannons are still on their original wooden carriage. The paint that remains on the gun is the original paint from the wartime, which is
I'm learning something new too, yeah.
Yeah. And anyway, this gun belonged to what was known at the time as the 2nd Rhode Island Battery. It later would become Battery A, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. And Battery A was attached to the Army of the Potomac. It was in all the major battles of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. But this particular gun only saw service at the first major battle of the American Civil War, Bull Run or Manassas. And that first battle was a horrendous defeat for the North, for the Union, for the Federal Army. Rhode Island, though, had a prominent role in that battle. So the brigade that the battery was attached to was led by Ambrose Burnside of Rhode Island. He did very well in this battle. They were actually the first brigade in the Union Army to engage the Confederates in combat. Anyway, the gun eventually exhausts its ammunition. They're under fire for hours. It's told to move to the rear because it has no more ammunition left. And at some point in the battle, Confederate reinforcements come in, and it turns the whole thing into a complete rout. And the Union Army literally runs 23 miles back to D.C.
Yep.
And a lot of war material was just left in this melee. And one of the Rhode Islanders was crossing Bull Run Creek, and he sees this cannon and recognizes it. It's attached still to its horses, and it's in the bottom of Bull Run Creek. And he asks some infantry to come help him, and they pull the gun out of the creek. And then as he's retreating with the gun, he runs into Charles Scott, who was one of the cannoneers on this particular piece. He recognizes the gun, couldn't believe that it had survived, and then he takes it all the way back to Centerville, Virginia, several miles from the battlefield, finds their unit magically, and everyone in the battery was so happy to see the return of the gun that they believed had been lost to the enemy. And it kind of became a symbol for Rhode Island, its survival, its ability to fight again, you know. And it helped improve morale, I think, with the men at the time. But the gun became the symbol, right? And it eventually was gifted during the Civil War to our governor, William Sprague. And he displayed the gun, I think, in the yard of his summer home in Narragansett, Rhode Island. And it still survives today, just untouched from that time.
So it never saw action again. And did it always stay in Narragansett? It found its way to an armory or something later on. It was on display in several places, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was at the Benefit Street Arsenal, I believe, for a period of time, which is where the battery left from. They trained at the Benefit Street Arsenal. It has a long history of being in different places. It was displayed at the old State House on Benefit Street. And then in 1903 on Smith Street, when the new state capitol opened, the gun was moved there along with the Gettysburg gun and was on display in the rotunda or outside the rotunda there for a long time.
The Gettysburg gun was Battery B
Yes.
at Gettysburg, and the light artillery from Manassas became Battery A?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
And at Gettysburg, Battery A was just north of where Battery B was. You could almost throw a rock and hit the battery. They were pretty close together. And there was some debate, actually, when the Gettysburg Gun was way out in front on July 2nd, that Battery A actually hit the Gettysburg Gun, and that some of the battle damage that you can see on the gun is, there's men at the time disputed that, but that was one of the claims. Yeah.
Of course they would. Well, that's interesting, and I know we learned last week from one of our docents that we were watching the opening of the movie Glory, and he said, "Oh, there's the Gettysburg Gun," and then he said, "Yeah, it appeared in the Gettysburg movie as well." Do we know if did the Bull Run gun ever? You say it was in good condition. Did it ever get brought into a movie at any time? Do we have any knowledge?
No, not the Bull Run gun, but the Gettysburg Gun, Battery B, along with the Rhode Island National Guard, they actually took the gun out of the State House. This is back in the late 80s. Yeah. And they took it down, I think it was the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Yep. But they returned the gun to the battlefield. They put it on the exact location where the gun was at during the battle. I wish I could have been there.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, that was the last time it had been moved out of the State House before we brought it to the Varnum Armory Museum.
Which was quite a task. We did this a year ago, and well, actually almost just about a year we've had it, and it was moved by all volunteers, and the Battery B reenactors, the militia, certainly had moved it before, but still we had to put on temporary wheels because you can't move it with the battle-damaged wheels that are on there. So I assume when they brought it to Gettysburg, they did that as well. I mean, it had to be well protected.
Yeah, they did that, but they didn't go to the extent that we went to. The gun, it's aged quite a bit. That was many years ago now. Yeah. It's hard to think of it being a long time ago, but the gun is in a very fragile state because of the battle damage and just sitting and drying out over time. We had to build a splint, if you remember, for the trail, the wooden tail of the carriage. Yeah. There's battle damage all over it, and we had to lift that, so we were worried that the whole trail would just snap. So we built a wood splint. That was a stressful weekend for me.
Yeah, I remember. So we also know that a book has been written about the Gettysburg Gun. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, the title of the book is Forever Silenced, The Story of the Gettysburg Gun, and the author is Stephen Evangelista. Stephen's a fantastic writer. He's a great speaker. He's a member of Battery B, the reenactment group today. He lives down in the Washington, D.C. area. He does a lot of programs with Battery B at the Gettysburg battlefield, but he was motivated to tell this story because there was so much folklore about the Gettysburg Gun, and you hear people tell little bits and pieces of it, but never the complete story. People get things wrong a lot of times. There was a belief that a lot of people will say that the cannonball that's stuck in the muzzle was the Confederate cannonball that hit
I heard that story when it was at the State House by somebody leading a tour.
Yeah, so that's not the case at all, of course, but so he wanted to correct the record. No one had done this before. Yeah. And he did a tremendous amount of research, primary research. And the theme of the story is that the Gettysburg Gun should not exist today, that there were so many opportunities in its long history of being lost. Multiple times during the Civil War, it was in danger, imminent danger of being lost or destroyed. And it's a miracle that the gun still exists today, is kind of the point he makes. And the Varnum Army Museum is a part of that story. There's a whole chapter at the end of the book devoted about our moving the gun to the museum. Yep. We believe that the gun belongs in a museum environment, that it needs that level of care. And now that we have the experts who understand preservation, conservation, we're taking care of the gun properly. Yeah. And,
So, do we have a date? We were planning to have an event where Mr. Evangelista would be available and do a book signing and talk about the book. That sounds on the way, right?
Yeah, so it's herding cats. We're trying to get a lot of different people involved, but this is an event basically to launch the exhibit formally at the Armory Museum. And so we intend to invite state VIPs, the governor, the secretary of the state, officers in the Rhode Island National Guard, et cetera. And Stephen would be a presenter there. We're going to have the Navy Band play a concert for those that go. we'll have the museum like an open house. And we have a lot of artifacts that are directly related to the gun.
Yes.
And we would bring those artifacts up and put them back with the gun for the
Wow.
first time
Yeah.
since the battle, which will be pretty emotional
Yes.
to see.
Now, believe it or not, one of my favorite pieces in our whole collection we call the Tennallytown Cannon, which was captured on the first summer of the Civil War, 1862, by a volunteer unit made up of students from Providence High School and Brown University, believe it or not.
Yep.
You want to tell us the story of the Tennallytown Cannon?
Yeah, so these kids, they were in Company B, 10th Rhode Island. Their parents only allowed them to go to war if the former governor of Rhode Island, Elisha Dyer, would agree to lead them, to be their commander. And he agrees to do this. And some members of Company B had been on doing a patrol, and they got intelligence that there was a Confederate cannon in the barn of a well-known Southern sympathizer. And so the whole company marches on this farm, and they go up to the farmhouse, they bang on the door, and the lady of the house opens, and she's like, "What do you want?" And they're like, "We want to see your cannon." She's like, "There's no cannon here." And at that moment, they spot the husband in the field. He starts to run, but he stops when they went after him. And he's like, "There's no cannon here." And right as this is happening, their little daughter comes walking home from school down the path there. And the first words out of her mouth was, "You're not getting our cannon." And so
Out of the mouths of babes.
So they threatened to arrest the whole family, march them back to camp. And under that threat, they gave up and they opened the barn door, and then lo and behold, was this not so big cannon.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think they expected to find something like the Bull Run gun or the Gettysburg gun. Instead, they found, actually, it's an interesting piece because it can be easily moved by one man.
Yeah, it's a little 1-inch rifle.
Yeah, it's a rifled
steel
barrel,
cannon,
and we're not quite sure where it was manufactured. I guess you've done some research on that.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting thing because it's on permanent loan to us from the National Guard, I believe. So it sits right between the Bull Run gun and the Gettysburg gun. So I thought it's one of, like I say, one of my favorite stories. We recently opened an exhibit devoted to what I guess we could call modern warfare, Korea, Vietnam, global war on terror, and actually special operations that are taking place. It's not completed, but we have opened it to the public. Last 2 open houses, it was very well received. People were very interested in the displays that we do have, and it'll really be something when we get it done. But maybe we could talk about a few of the things that are on display, and it's a new exhibit. We have some interesting things from the Korean War. You want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of items from the Korean War. We're always, by the way, actively looking for objects. So if there's anyone out there that has items that are tied to somebody from Rhode Island from these periods, I'd love to talk to you to see if you'd be willing to loan or gift those items to us for display. But yeah, in one display case, we have a little collection of U.S. infantry items from the Korean War. We have an M1 helmet from that time period. We have the famous knit cap that I think most Americans would recognize. It was worn by Radar
O'Reilly.
and MASH. Yeah, we have an M1 carbine that's been modified, for Korean War use, and some other field gear and things like that. But and then in Vietnam, we have a significant number of items that were captured from the Viet Cong, from the NVA. We have some captured flags, a guidon. We actually we haven't put this out yet, but we have a very rare, the black pajama uniform of the Viet Cong, including the hat and even the shoes, these sandals, these rubber.
Yeah, they used to cut rubber tires, actually, and make sandals out of them.
Yeah, and amazing that we have that. So we're going to have that mounted on a dress form and put out. But we have a small collection of items. A lot of the things in our museum come from our own membership. Mm-hmm. And an example of that is one of our members lives in North Kingstown. His name is Will King. He served in Vietnam. He was in a combat role. He basically was side to side with the South Vietnamese army.
He speaks Vietnamese. He was.
Yeah, that is amazing to me. He's fluent in the local dialect. And anyway, he served side by side with these people and fought in some pretty serious combat. And we have a group of items that he actually took from a Viet Cong officer, some personal items that, one of the reasons, or one of the purposes of our museum is really to help people understand the cost of war and to see the devastation that war can cause and the personal damage that war can cause. And I think this type of exhibit, does that, communicates that.
Yeah, and I learned that the character Radar O'Reilly was played by a gentleman named Gary Bergdorf, who is from Bristol, Connecticut.
Oh, really?
Yeah, somebody who knows him told me that. We looked at the exhibit, and we have a picture of him next to the.
Yeah.
It's actually a 1941 helmet liner type thing. They called it a Jeep driver's cap in World War II, but everybody knows it as the hat Radar O'Reilly cap. So one of the other things going into the global war on terror, of course, is we have a two-page letter written by President George W. Bush, a handwritten letter.
Yeah, so this is, to me, this is kind of the centerpiece of our Global War on Terror exhibit. So again, for people that are unfamiliar with our museum, kind of our focus is on Rhode Island military history specifically. So almost everything you see in the museum is directly tied to Rhode Island, a specific person, to a specific unit. And so this centerpiece exhibit for the Global War on Terror is a West Point uniform worn by your son, Mathew August. He's a West Point graduate, and he heroically gave his life really defending his men, protecting his men. He was killed by an IED. My understanding was he was in a column. They go up and down this particular road, I guess, quite often. And this one particular day, something just didn't feel right to him, and he stopped the entire column, told the column to stay behind, got in a Humvee by himself, rode on up a hill, and an IED exploded and took his life. And if he had not paused that column and done that, other men would have been killed and wounded. So, but anyway, we have his West Point uniform. We have other items that he had associated with his service. And one of the unique things that's part of that collection is a two-page letter, not just signed by President George Bush, but actually handwritten by George Bush. And you can explain the letter better than me.
In June of 2007, President George W. Bush came to the Naval War College. And people don't realize that one of the things he did very frequently is when he went to different places in the country, his advance party would contact Gold Star parents and siblings and children and invite them to meet with the president. And we got a call one day from the Secret Service in Washington asking for some information, and they said, President Bush is coming to Rhode Island, he wants to meet with you. And at first, when they started asking for information like your birthday and where you were born, wait a minute, give me your name and your phone number, I'll call you back. And I called the Secret Service in Providence and asked them if they knew what was going on. They didn't even know the president was coming. And this agent said, I'll get back to you. And the next day he called and said, yeah, it's legitimate, you can talk to this guy. So when we went to the Naval War College, we were met with a military escort. We actually, where we were sitting, we could see the president arrive. And I think one of the things people don't realize, when the president goes anywhere, you can't imagine the security. And you'll see the president, whoever it is, will get off on Air Force One, they'll get off on the White House lawn. Whenever he goes anywhere, there's two Marine ones, two. And they fly back, and one behind the other, so that a terrorist would not know which one he's in. And when they come in finally for the final landing, one of them will break off, and they're also surrounded by Apache gunships or Huey helicopters, smaller helicopters, all the way down to the ground, and then they break away, and the Marine One with the president lands. And so we saw that, and I went, this is amazing. And he got out and he walked over and came in, and we talked to him. And what happened was they brought us into private rooms with small groups, and there was probably 8 of us maybe. My wife and my daughter were with me. And the president just sat down on a couch, and he had one aide with him. The Secret Service stayed outside, and he said, anybody got any questions? So we were talking, and I had written a letter the previous day, and I said, Mr. President, may I give you a letter? I didn't know what the protocol was. And he said, sure. And I gave him the letter, and he put it in his pocket. And I thought, well, that'll be the end of that. 2 days later, we get this handwritten letter that was, I believe, was written on Air Force One on the way back, because he addresses the specific points I raised in the letter. And in his letter, he also refers to a comment my daughter made to him about the No Child Left Behind Act. And my wife had mentioned our older son, who was an Air Force officer in Germany. And he referred to both of those remarks. So I know this was not machine written or anything, right? So, yeah, so I was kind of surprised. And I think
it says a lot about him as a person.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It shows a side of him that many people aren't aware of.
Sure.
And one of the things he said to us was, no president sends troops into battle without knowing that some of them aren't going to come home and some are going to come home in bad shape. And so it's done very reluctantly. That was, pretty profound. But anyway, we were pleased to present that as part of I think everybody should see it, and it's...
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the other things we'd like to talk about is, I remember going to an event at the South Portico of the State House, and at the time there was all kinds of battle flags there. And they're just sitting there, and I just looked at them, I said, these got to go back to the Revolutionary War. And they were obviously in pretty bad shape. They were in the sunshine, not air conditioned, not dehumidified.
Correct.
And I don't know how long they've been here. But anyway, you learned that they were no longer there, that they had been moved to Massachusetts?
Yeah, so I think it was 2016, somewhere in that time frame, but people realized in the state government that we can't continue to have these flags in this type of environment. So kudos to the state government for having the presence of mind to take those flags out of those cabinets in there. And they had a committee formed to figure out how to take care of these flags, and they were stabilized by a textile conservator and then placed in storage in an art storage facility up in Massachusetts. And they're safe, but they're packed in boxes. There's 83 flags in total. Yeah,
I know there's a lot of them.
They're the state's most historic battle flags. These are all the regimental flags from the American Civil War. They basically go from the Revolutionary War through about World War II.
Yeah, oh really, okay.
Yep, and the two most historically significant flags are the two Revolutionary War flags. They're two flags that were both carried by the so-called Rhode Island Regiment in 1781. They were carried by a unit that was made up of the famous Black Regiment of 1778. There was not many of those guys left by 1781, and the remains of the 2nd Rhode Island, who had been in a lot of combat over the course of the Revolutionary War. These two units were combined into one. Yeah. And these were the two flags that unit carried. And their leader, Colonel Jeremiah Olney, basically at the conclusion of the war, presented these two flags to the state legislature for safekeeping. And they're incredibly historic. There's only, to give you a sense of how rare these flags are, there's estimated to be 24 flags in existence in the world from the American Revolution. And they estimate that there was probably, at the time of the war, over 600 flags and banners in use by the Army at the time. So we're down to 24, and Rhode Island has 2. And so I've kind of made it my mission to finally conserve these flags and put them on display again. And we're starting with these 2 Revolutionary War flags. So I formed a partnership with the National Museum of the U.S. Army, located in Fort Belvoir,
Virginia. Yep.
Yep. And basically, they would take one flag and conserve it and display it for their 250th anniversary exhibit that's kicking off in June.
June 14th of next year.
Correct. And then, right, for the birthday of the U.S. Army. And then the other flag we would take at the Varnum Army Museum, we would conserve it. We have a textile conservator that's part of our organization. She's
Excellent
our
one.
Yep, she's our vice president. And she's collections manager at the Newport Naval War College Museum. Anyway, we would do the conservation, we would mount it, and then we would display it here at the Varnum Army Museum and other events around the state for the 250th anniversary of our country. But for this to happen, this took a lot of work.
Oh, yeah.
We had to map out who all the stakeholders were. We had to build a case for this. It's still pending our part of the deal. So the U.S. Army actually now has one of the two flags. It's in West Virginia at one of the best conservation labs in the world. It's being worked on as we speak. And then the other flag, we just literally 2 weeks ago submitted our formal proposal, our statement of work for the conservation, our display plan, loan contract, those types of things. We're not asking for ownership. This is just a loan, temporary loan. And but the other big barrier to this whole thing is we literally had to change the law.
They had to get legislation passed.
Yeah, so that took a lot of effort, but it did pass unanimously with the House and the Senate.
Yeah.
And kudos to everyone in the government that supported that. The governor also supported the Secretary of State, so we appreciate that. So the law's been changed, and we're actually going to have in a couple weeks some state officials are going to come in from the Department of Administration, the Secretary of State's office, the State Archives, and the Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission. They're going to come in and basically do an inspection of the building and make sure we're a good place for this flag.
What is the estimated or the appraised value of those flags?
Yeah, no one believed me for a while, but they've been officially appraised at $3 million a flag.
Sure. Yeah. We're getting down to the end of the road here, but I think this is an important event, and hopefully we'll have that on display, as you say, in the not too distant future. Yeah. And we found out that our famous Bayfield flag.
Byfield flag.
I said it again. Forgive me, Colonel Byfield. His colors, we're going to keep those on display. So at some point, we'll have both of those on display together.
Yeah, the oldest flag in America, and then the Revolutionary War flag.
How can people, we have open houses, we offer private tours. About a half a minute left. Can you tell people how they can arrange that? How do they find out about them?
Yeah, so we're doing 2 open houses a month on average. They're typically on Sundays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. We have a calendar of when those open houses are on our website. It's varnumcontinentals.org. It's probably easier to just Google Armory, East Greenwich, and you'll find us. And then also in that Tour of the Armory page, you will also see a form if you wanted to do a private tour. Yeah. We'll give you a 2-hour private tour.
At least.
Sometimes more.
We kind of run a little bit over, but
depends on the interest level.
And the availability of a docent to do it.
Right.
I mean, you spend a lot of time there, but others try to. So
yes.
We have to wrap it up, and I want to thank Patrick Donovan for coming back again and talking about this stuff. And I think people in Rhode Island have to be made aware of our heritage and our military history here, which goes all the way back to the French and Indian Wars, really. So thank you again for coming down, and I want to thank the audience for watching this edition of State of the State, and I look forward to seeing you at an open house.